All right, let's talk about institutional economics. So, as Buchholz told us, we basically think about the old institutionalists and then the new institutionalists. The old institutionalists basically came in and said, hey, mainstream economics is missing some important things. And the new institutionalists came in and said, hey, you're right, let's bring them into economics. Old institutionalists were a little bit more critical. The new institutionalists used their critical thinking to incorporate that. Marx might say that they were doing the synthesis, their new thesis incorporating the previous antithesis. But certainly, as a general perspective, this brings up an important point. Often, as economists, we will simplify away the social aspects of humanity. Right? We're pack animals. We're meant to live in a society, but it's a lot easier to model humans as atomistic agents, as something like what Veblen would have called a globule of hedonic potential, bouncing around but unchanged, untransformed by those experiences. So, a very fascinating instance of how of important economic activity that's missed when we miss that social aspect of humanity is the issue of signaling. So Veblen gives this signal example of conspicuous consumption. And conspicuous consumption is very closely related to my favorite example to talk about signaling of a peacock. So, what's special about a peacock? A peacock has this big, stupid tail. It is a parachute hanging off the backside of this bird that's trying to survive in the jungle. And peahens are attracted to this big, stupid tail. Why? Because if a peacock survives with a tail that big, that cumbersome, it must be that they've got something going on that is going to contribute to the potential survival of their progeny. A peacock with a big stupid tail that's still alive, it must be smart or fast or strong or something, but it's got something important. It is giving an important signal, right? In economics, we have a lot of signals, right? Revealed preferences is a form of signal. It's a signal. It's when your actions signal something about your values, about something going on in your head. A peacock's survival with that big tail signals something about their underlying fitness. In the case of conspicuous consumption, or conspicuous leisure, what's going on here is someone is showing by hanging around cafes all day or by driving around in big flashy cars that they have a lot of wealth, that they have a lot of something that should give them higher social standing, should give them status within this social system that our economy is embedded in. I think a nice updating of this concept is from one of my friends from grad school, Ryan Murphy, who talked about conspicuous authenticity. So, a similar sort of example here. So, you think about, say, how people think about tans. So, at the time Veblen was writing, having a tan was a signal that you worked outside. So being really, really pale signaled that you didn't have to work hard for a living, right? You must be a fancy person if you don't have a tan. More recently, having a tan signals that you don't have to spend all your time working in an office. You have the ability to go out and take a vacation to somewhere tropical. The signal and the meaning of that signal has changed as society has changed with it. So conspicuous consumption, another thing that's changed is it used to be really hard to signal your social status by having fancy, flashy, shiny things. But in the last 100 years, it's gotten really, really easy to get stuff. Stuff and material wealth is very, very easy. And when something's easy, it doesn't send a strong signal. This is kind of the big thing with a signal, is a signal is only useful to the extent it's hard to get that signal. That's why the peacock's tail is an effective signal, because the stakes are high, right? If you are really a low fitness peacock, but you have a big tail, you're going to get eaten. You're not going to last long. Likewise, all across economics. So another famous example is Michael Spence's job market signaling theory. If you do something that's really difficult, like getting a degree in astrophysics, even if you're not going to be an astrophysicist, that it's so difficult means that you are sending a credible signal to employees that you're capable of doing something difficult. So, coming to how do we change our signals when it becomes relatively easy to get material markers of wealth? Well, we start looking for things that are harder to duplicate. So something like going on a really cool, authentic trip to somewhere, or having, the real, authentic, hard to find, real Chinese food instead of strip mall American Chinese food. That sort of authenticity that you can make conspicuous on your Instagram feed is the new way to signal that you've got essentially conspicuous leisure, this ability to take time off and focus on signaling stuff rather than being driven by productivity, being driven by the need to, meet your basic needs. What are we doing here? We are signaling our status. We're signaling our ability to do fancy people's stuff. And the types of signals that we engage in change over time. Another example of signals, right? One that's definitely changed. At the time Veblen was writing, sending your son to college was a way to signal that you had enough resources that you could send your kid to do nothing for 4 years. It was a signal that you had a lot of money. It was a signal that you didn't need your kid earning money to pay for rent or to take care of grandma or whatever else. Later on, college took on a different sort of a signal. After the GI Bill, after World War II, it became this way to signal your skills, your ability to do hard stuff, like get a degree in astrophysics. Now we've gotten to a point where it's a signal that so many people have that it's no longer a strong signal of work capability. Instead, the lack of the college degree sends a really bad negative signal. So college has been a signaling behavior, and the nature of that signal has changed as our underlying reality has changed. Another one, white clothing, right? So getting married in a white dress is not an easy thing to do if you're, say, a medieval peasant and everything you own is covered in mud, right? Dressing in white signals that you can afford to spend a lot of resources keeping clothing clean. Advertising, another trickier one. So when you look at something like, say, Bud Light advertising in the Super Bowl, they're talking about how it's a cool, crisp, refreshing beer, but we know it's Bud Light, right? We know it's not great beer. But we do get a signal that the Budweiser, that Anheuser-Busch, the corporation, is not planning to go away anywhere anytime soon. You don't spend billions of dollars on advertising if you're a fly-by-night operation. So even though the ads might not be signaling information about the product, they might be giving us information about the company behind the product, giving us reason to believe that they're not going to cut corners, that they're going to continue to provide the same consistent product they've had for a long time. So signaling right there, really great, important tool to have in the back of your head. A lot of what we do as humans really boils down to signaling. Signals, on the one hand, it involves facing a lot of costs. It seems in a lot of ways like it's irrational behavior, but still it's something where the individual undertaking the behavior to engage in these signals perceives some benefit to themselves relative to those costs. All right, so let's skip most of the old institutionalists. Really, the most important stuff for us is in the new institutionalists. And what they provide is a recognition of that core insight of the old institutionalists, that there's a lot going on. There's a lot that we hide in our ceteris paribus assumption. But they go beyond just saying we're hiding a lot of stuff. The new institutionalists actually take the tools of modern neoclassical economics. They use those powerful tools to tell those stories about what's going on within the ceteris paribus. What are we holding constant? We're holding constant things like our legal structure. So a really important case there is the Coase theorem. Now, Coase hated the term Coase theorem. I think it was it Stigler? I think it was Stigler, who gave it the term the Coase theorem. So in the late 50s, Coase starts writing about externality problems. In 1960, he presents this paper, and this changes the way economists think about externalities. Before 1960, we were in an entirely Pigouvian framework. Now, it turns out if you go back and you read Pigou, he was a lot more subtle than we give him credit for. But as a rough simplification, before 1960, we thought of pollution being a thing where we would want to tax the factory that's polluting to get them to do something about it. Coase introduces the idea that the people downwind have agency also, and they might be the low-cost provider of the solution to the externality. So you think about something like if you step out onto a freeway and get run over by a car, who was the low-cost person? Who could have made a choice that avoided that problem at the least cost? Well, if you're stepping onto a freeway, you're probably the one who created the problem, right? You could have avoided that. So although in some sense it looks like you were the victim, you got run over, the solution, the efficient solution, is for you to avoid walking on the freeway to begin with. Coase gives us this idea of it might not be that the factory should stop polluting on you, but maybe you should do something to avoid being where the pollution is. Now, it's not as simple as saying, you have to do something. The more elaborate thing is bringing in the notion of property rights. There's a really nice illustration of this at marginalrevolutionuniversity.org, mru.org, under their principles of micro. They've got a few different examples. Since I'm still kind of congested, I'm going to skip doing that in much depth, but let's at least find this under externalities. Close that. Coase theorem, here we go. And we got some practice questions. Let's go ahead and take a look at a practice question. We'll free right off that. So, if you've got a factory in the middle of nowhere that's producing a nasty smell, an externality, if no one's around to experience the externality, what kind of externality is it? Well, putting aside the possibility of this smell is correlated with some other pollution that's going to blow off and negatively affect people, if the only problem is the smell and no one's around to smell it, then it's not an externality. If someone moves into this factory, who caused the problem, right? So someone moves next to this problem, they have gone to the nuisance. This is like you stepping out onto the freeway, right? You caused the problem in that case. So before Coase, economists would look at this and say, ooh, we should shut down the smelly factory, or we should put on a filter or something. Coase introduces the fact that, well, if you're moving next to this factory and you sue them, you're going to lose this case. On that point, so let's do a real quick example. So let's see if this works. Let's do I've got a better, here we go, canvaspaint.org. So we've got, let's say, a factory, and they're polluting on a resort downwind from them. And we want to think about how might this play out if this works for me. All right, we got our factory. And we've got the smoke blowing downwind. And this smoke blowing downwind is going to make the people downwind unhappy about that smoke. So, like I said, before Coase, we would have thought, okay, we've got this problem, we've got the smoke, the problem is coming from over here, and so we want something going on this side, right? We want the solution to be something from the factory to prevent this problem. But what Coase introduces is the notion that maybe these people do something, and that's the efficient way to deal with this problem. So there's two essential ingredients here. One is, we call it zero transaction costs. So transaction costs, these are the costs of coming up with some agreement. Zero is a bit much, right? Zero is extreme. We're assuming a can opener here. We're making an over extreme simplifying assumption. But let's just say low transaction costs. If it's relatively easy to come up with a deal, then we have the possibility of Coase theorem applying. The other ingredient is property rights. So we need one, clear property rights, and two, low transaction costs. So let's say that we go to the court, and the court says the people downwind have a right to clean air. So if they sue the factory, they're going to shut down the factory. But let's make up some numbers here just to see how we might want this to change. So let's say we've got an externality causing $50,000 worth of harm, and let's say the factory has a $40,000 solution, and let's say the resort has a $30,000 solution. The $30,000 solution is what we want to see happen. So how does that happen if we have clear property rights, in this case held by the resort, and low transaction costs? So the lawyers get together, they say if this goes to court, the court's going to find in favor of the resort. They're going to tell the factory to install the smokestack filter. But we have this cheaper option. And the way this cheaper option is going to work is the factory's lawyers are going to go to the resort's lawyers and they're going to say, how about if we pay you $35,000 to put this solution into practice? That resolves the problem, and it saves society $10,000 worth of resources. We're spending $30,000 on the solution instead of $40,000. And we're making it a win-win situation. So the resort is $5,000 better off compared to, if they just avoided the problem, right? They are doing better having this side payment. All right. This is one of these things I think is easier if you go through on your own. I think a really good place for this, David Friedman is an economist who teaches at Santa Clara Law School, and he's very generously put his book Law's Order up on his website, daviddfriedman.com. The chapters on externalities are fascinating. If any of you guys are thinking about taking up a career in law, definitely read this book. You can get it for $10 on Amazon. You can read it for $0 on David Friedman's website. Really fascinating insight into a really core thing from the New Institutionalists is this understanding of the interaction of institutions, right? The laws of the game and the decisions that we make. Really fascinating look at what economics has to do with the law and why it matters. So, Coase theorem, in here he's got some numerical examples. I'm going to skip over these, but I would recommend skimming through this certainly before we get to the final exam, which is coming up in about a month. So, another interesting thing that came up in this reading related to law and economics is Richard Posner, who had this hypothesis that the common law tends towards efficiency, which is a really fascinating idea and actually pretty compelling. The idea that Posner has in mind here is people who have conflicts that have to do with, say, improperly or ill-defined property rights, situations where it's not clear what I can do and what you can do, and therefore we butt heads, right? We have some sort of a problem, one of us sues the other, and then we end up with case law. This is how the common law develops over time. As you have a problem, it goes to court, the judge finds in someone's favor and tries to lay down the logic of the situation to avoid having that problem come up again. A judge who keeps dealing with a case related to the same sorts of problems over and over and over again obviously didn't do a good job finding the decision in the first place. So a judge's job is effectively to avoid this conflict, and if they're doing this job, then what we're going to end up finding is that over time we kind of get this Coasian logic happening. We get property rights going to the highest valued place and rules being set up in a way to try to reduce conflict. So this is all our stuff in the background. What are institutions? Let's go back to our basic questions. So institutions is this term that kind of captures a lot of things, but in a nutshell, it's the rules of the game. Now, another important thing to bear in mind here is we have formal rules and we have informal rules. Another economist who we've heard mention in the book before, Friedrich Hayek, has a distinction between law and legislation. Legislation is the formal rules. Law is the sort of informal expectations. So if you think about something like, what's the speed limit on the LIE? Well, the legislation says 55. That's what it says on the sign. That's what it says on the books. That's what's written down. But if you got pulled over for doing 55 or 56 or 60, you'd be upset, right? That would not line up with your expectations about the rules. Your expectations are determining what you're actually going to do. What you're actually going to do is you're going to drive 60, 65, 70, right? If you're driving 75 and you get pulled over, you're going to be upset still, right? But you kind of know, all right, if you see a cop, you don't necessarily go to 75. If you get pulled over at 80, okay, yeah, you're going a little bit too fast. Yeah, you can get away with driving 80, but, you've got an ambiguity there. 55, there's not much ambiguity, right? It's a hard line, it's well defined, but it is not really the actual speed limit, right? The actual speed limit's a little bit higher. The informal rule is sort of what matters more. But again, this is the interesting stuff that's hidden in our ceteris paribus assumption when we're looking at, whatever economic decisions. So if we're looking at your decision of when do you decide to join rush hour traffic, when do you decide to skip that, when do you decide to take the LIE versus the frontage road versus back streets, right? This is holding all else constant, and included in that is things like what are the rules, including the rules of when are you actually going to get pulled over. You're going to get pulled over for driving 56? No, so you're going to drive faster than 56. A very important set of rules, really it's an important complex of rules, is the rules related to how we can make decisions about property, right? So this very Pigouvian story, including making decisions about pollution going into the air or making decisions about how many cars are going to be on the freeway. Well, that's a decision where we're each individually making it in a decentralized fashion. But it's all these sort of collected sets of rules and how they interact that are really shaping the incentives that we're all responding to. So let's do this. Let's go back to the questions that we had for this past week. I believe our last set of questions was, how do these things relate to having positive sum interactions in a growing economy, contract enforcement, patience, and reputation? Here we go. All right, so let's come back to these questions to kind of guide and wrap up some of what we've said. So, Veblen's theory of conspicuous consumption, our big idea is that people will consume in a way that isn't about the good itself, it's about how people see them with that good. So people who buy a Louis Vuitton bag aren't buying a Louis Vuitton bag because they really need a really good bag for carrying stuff around, Right? If you want a good bag for carrying stuff around, you get one of those big blue IKEA bags. You get a Louis Vuitton bag because it shows people that you have the money to waste. You have so much money, you're so fancy and important that you can spend 20 grand on something that you could get for 5 cents. If you go to Uncle Gunta's and say, hey, I want a grocery bag, that bag is just as useful and costs a lot less. But spending money is giving you something that other people don't have access to, and you can show that you have access to that. Conspicuous consumption is about being seen doing something that other people can't do, something that people have less ability to access. So buying a Louis Vuitton bag is an example, sending your kid to Harvard is an example, and these are all signals. These are ways of demonstrating something about yourself. And signals are effective to the extent they are hard to replicate. All right, Coase theorem. Coase theorem is this idea that with clear property rights and low transaction costs, we can bargain to efficient outcomes. So in a nutshell, what this means is if the resort is the low cost, got rid of that graph already, if the resort is the locus of avoiding the problem at lowest cost, we want them to do it, not necessarily the polluter. How do we get that? Well, we look for a side deal that's going to make both sides better off. Who's going to pay for it? It's going to be the person who doesn't have the property right. Who's going to solve the problem? It's going to be whoever has the lowest cost, right? So if the resort has the property right and they have the lowest cost, the factory is going to have to pay them to do it. But in doing so, we're going to find a lower cost way to deal with the externality. Like I said, David Friedman, his chapters on this are excellent. Marginal Revolution University also does a nice walkthrough of this. What do economists mean by institutions? We mean the rules of the game. So we don't mean institutions in the same way that we talk about a financial institution, which is a bank or a central bank or something like that. We mean things like laws, expectations. It could be informal things. It could be things like etiquette. So things that are going to determine what we think are, what options are within our range of acceptable choices. The rules of the game are going to put boundaries on what we can do. What was the mainstream view of the best way to deal with externalities before 1960? Pigouvian taxes. Factories pollute. If you throw a tax on them, that's going to induce them to cut back on their pollution. It will induce them to find a low-cost way to deal with the pollution. But in 1960, Ronald Coase convinced economists that it's more complicated than that. There's this other missing piece, which is if you have conditions right, it might be that the person being polluted on might be the low-cost solver of the problem. And if we have the right side deal, we might be able to get to that without imposing a solution from the top down through government. All right. Now, what do these things have to do with positive sum cooperation? Again, one of my favorite concepts in social science, the evolution of cooperation. So a nice simple way to tell this story is with an iterated prisoner's dilemma. You and I keep interacting. We each have incentive to do the short run thing, to screw over our partner so that I get ahead in the short run. But if we're going to keep playing this game, if we're going to keep interacting, then we have this potential to get much more in the long run if we can cooperate. Right? So how do we get people to cooperate like this instead of hitting each other over the head, smashing each other with rocks and taking each other's stuff? Well, let's start with patience, the one in the middle. That's really the key one. So if you've got no patience, you don't care what happens tomorrow, you only care about what happens today, you're only ever going to go for the short run temptation. It's when you're patient enough to think about the long run that cooperating in the long run becomes worthwhile. If we think the world is going to end tomorrow, we're not going to do things like plant trees. But if we are patient enough that we care about how things will turn out in 100 years, then we will plant trees. So having patience is essential to have positive sum cooperation, right? We need to be patient enough to turn down that short-run temptation. Contract enforcement also helps us to turn down that short-run temptation. If I'm afraid that I hit you over the head and I take your stuff, but then you sue me and I lose the lawsuit and the police come and take your stuff back, that contract enforcement reduces my incentive to be impatient, to do the things that an impatient person would do. And they also mean that I can be more confident that you're going to continue to contribute to our ongoing project. Right? So let's say you and I start a business. If I'm impatient and if the courts aren't going to enforce our contracts and I don't care about reputation, then I might just be lazy and let you do all the hard work and I just pull all the money out of our joint bank account. We're not going to be very effective in that case. But if I'm afraid that I'm going to get sued, right, or better yet, I act like a jerk and then I get sued and then you take over the company, that contract enforcement is going to limit my ability to do the things that prevent us from getting that positive sum interaction and from building up the value in our partnership. And then related to this, repeated transactions or reputation. If we're going to keep doing this over and over again, if I keep acting like a jerk, you're going to stop doing that with me, and I'm going to lose access to these long-run benefits. But if I have a good reputation and lots of people want to do business with me, then I'm going to have more access to these benefits. And the more that we have these repeated interactions or this possibility of reputation, the more we have ability to engage in gains from trade, to create new wealth. An interesting example of this from a few years ago is the Silk Road. There used to be this online drug market. I'm sure it still exists in some form. Not the original Silk Road, but if we go, let's look up on Wikipedia. Basically, people could use Bitcoin to buy drugs from strangers on the internet. But if you just send Bitcoin to a stranger on the internet and say, please send me drugs, let me find, here we go, here's the one I'm talking about. Here's some money, please give me some drugs. Well, they're anonymous. Why should they send me drugs? So given that, you wouldn't think that you'd be able to get an anonymous marketplace for illegal things, because I send you money and then you just don't send me anything, and then, well, I'm not going to send you money again, and pretty soon the whole thing should fall apart. How it ended up working was they created a market where the marketplace, the Silk Road, offered a way for drug sellers to demonstrate trustworthiness and to establish a reputation. So in the same way, when you go to eBay, you can buy from trusted sellers. You can see the reviews of the sellers themselves. You could see the sellers' reviews on the Silk Road. And if someone had bad reputation, you wouldn't buy from them. How do you get a good reputation? You make good on the orders that your customers make. So that was a way to overcome what should have been a situation where you couldn't have had a market. It made it so that there was a reputation, there were repeated transactions, so that this market was able to exist at all. All right, so that's a case where the formal rules are drugs are bad and illegal and you're not allowed to buy and sell them. But you had this smaller thing within society where you had these rules that said, if you say you're going to pay for drugs and you don't, then you lose reputation. If you say you're going to sell someone drugs and you don't, you're going to lose reputation. And if you lose reputation, you're going to have a hard time finding more business. So that's a way that people are able to get off the ground, to get gains from trade, to go from short-run temptation of just hit each other over the head and rob each other, and instead into a world where we have positive sum gains, positive sum interactions where we're able to get create economic value. All right, so there's a lot of really fascinating things in here. If you haven't already, I know there were some people who were having trouble uploading their final project submission. If you haven't sent that to me by email or submitted it, make sure you do that. there's a lot of really fascinating institutionalists who would be great to do a final project on. So writing about, Coase's notion of transaction costs, talking about the Ostroms and how they understood what they learned about informal institutions. There's a ton of really great stuff in here. All right, so thank you for your patience with my stuffy nose. Thanks for waiting for me to turn this in late. This is also a good point to mention. We are coming up to the end of the semester, so our basic format, we're at the point in the class where the work is getting harder. Now we're working on the final project, and then Module 15, we're going to have that final exam. What we've been doing is almost just kind of like show us your notes, talk a bit. We've basically been doing completion points on the weekly assignments. The stakes are going to be a lot higher when we get to Module 15. My expectations are going to be higher. I'm not going to be grading on a completion basis. So this is a good point to go back through these old videos, make sure you understand what's going on. Stop by office hours, ask me questions, because we've only got a little bit more than a month to get those questions in. All right, so that's it for this week. I will see you next week when we talk about Keynes. Adios. As usual, let me know if you have questions in the usual places, and I will talk to you in the future.